I will say today we have the incredible privilege to Emir Hashem begin the third parak of Maseches Moed Kattan, Daf Yud Dalej, page 14a. We are picking up Emir Hashem at the Mishnah on Yud Gimel Amud Beis 13b. So the Mishnah says as follows: Ve'elu magalchin b'moed. These are the individuals who are permitted to go ahead, and magalchin, giluach, usually means both shaving as well as hair cutting. So these are the individuals who are permitted to engage in shaving and hair cutting. Now, the Mishnah presupposes that we know that shaving and hair cutting is asar and chalamayid. Where that comes from, Emir Hashem will see in the Gemara. Ve'elu magalchin b'moed. These are the individuals who have a license to shave and get a haircut and chalamayid. Habam udinas hayam, someone who returns from overseas travel, or beis hashivya, someone who was held in captivity, vayotze mi beis ha'asurin, or someone who was incarcerated, Vamenuda shetilo chachamim, someone who was excommunicated. Often, again, nidui was the result of someone who failed to comply with certain directives of a beis din, certain obligations in community, and as a result, he's excommunicated. Part of his excommunication is that he's not permitted to cut his hair, he's not permitted to shave. So we're talking about a person who was released from his nidui before chalamayid, right before Yom Tov or on chalamayid. Or if somebody made a neder, for example, not to shave. Someone took a neder not to shave, not to take a haircut, and he was released from the neder on chalamayid. V'hanazir, v'hamitzora, mitum asu l'tarasu. And a nazir, who's obviously not permitted to shave or take a haircut. A mitzora, who's obligated to allow his hair to grow as well. And both of these individuals achieved purity. They achieved purification on chalamayid. So ultimately, again, the idea being over here, and you could see, these are all individuals who essentially did not have the opportunity to shave or take a haircut before chalamayid. Therefore, again, they have a license to do so on chalamayid itself. These are the people who could launder their clothing on chalamayid. Habam dinas hayam, someone who comes from overseas, or beis hashivya, or someone who was released from captivity. Vayotze beis ha'asurin, or someone who was released from prison. Top of Yud Daled. Umenuda shetir lo chachamim, or again, someone who was excommunicated and then had his excommunication lifted or repealed by the chachamim. Or let's say somebody made a neder not to go ahead and launder his clothing, and he was released from the neder on chalamayid, v'hutar. So we'll say all of these situations ultimately, again, are circumstances where you could launder your clothing on chalamayid. It's the same yisod, really the same exact yisod, namely being the idea that these people didn't have an opportunity to engage in the process of laundering their clothing before chalamayid, and therefore halacha l'maisa, they have a license to do so on chalamayid. The Mishnah goes on, mitpachos hayadayim, hand towels, mitpachos hasabarim, barber's, now literally means barber's towels. What it means is, Rashi points out, the barber's cloth, which is the cloth that the barber used to put on. You know, they do it today also. You go for a haircut, the barber puts on the cloth so that the hair doesn't get all over you. That's called mitpachos hasapar, mitpachos hasafak, or bath towels. You are allowed to launder these on chalamayid. Again, we'll discuss why that is. These seems to be just on a most basic level because they're necessary for chalamayid use. A person doesn't have an inexhaustible supply of bath towels, so therefore I'm permitted, or again, hand towels, or for that matter, the barber who has the license to cut the hair of these individuals also needs his towels. And similarly, again, hazavin, v'hazavos, hanidos, v'hayoldos. Certainly, if a person is a zav or a zava, nidos and yoldos, these are all people who experience emissions, and because they experience emissions, they may need to launder their clothing or other items on a relatively regular basis. And anyone in general who has transitioned from a state of ritual impurity to purity, hare elu mutarin, they are mutar to launder, ushar kol adam asur, and everyone else is asur. Again, we'll define the exact parameters of what the Mishnah is saying, but bigadol, in a general sense, the Mishnah is introducing us to the idea you can't take a haircut, you can't shave, you can't launder your clothing on chalamayid, unless, of course, there's an extenuating need. And the extenuating need can take one of two forms. Either you didn't have the ability to do so before Yom Tov, or you had the ability to do so before Yom Tov, but your circumstances are such that you still need to launder. For example, Zavin, Zavos, Nidos, Yoldos, people who have frequent emissions. Says the Gemara, Ushar kol adam mai taima asurin. So ask the Gemara, what's the problem? Why can't a regular person shave or take a haircut or launder clothing on chalamayid? What's the issue here? Kedisnan. So the Gemara says it's like a Mishnah that we learned about. So we had this in Maseches Tainis. Anshe Mishmar va'anshe Maimod asrun l'saper lechabes ubechamishi mutar mnei kavod Shabbos. So we'll say the people of the Mishmar. Remember again, the Kahuna was split up into 24 Mishmaros. There were also Ma'amados. We did this extensively in Maseches Tainus, where there were groups, there were cohorts of Kohanim, Yisraelim, Kohanim, Leviim, Yisraelim. Some would go to the Beis HaMikdash, some would gather, Yisraelim would gather in the local towns. What's the halacha? They are not permitted to go ahead and launder their clothing, nor are they permitted to go ahead and shave, take a haircut over the course of their week that they're on duty. On Thursday of that week, they're permitted to do so. L'kavod Shabbos. V'amar Rabba bar Bachana Amar Belazar. My time. What's the reason? Why can't the people of the Mishmar and the people of the Maimed, why can't they launder their clothing or take a haircut? Kadesh le'yikansu le'mishmar san kishem menuvalin. In order that, what are we concerned about? See, if a person knows, right, a person knows anyway that he's going to have quote unquote a week off from work, right? The Kohen knows he's going to the Beis HaMikdash. The Levi is going to the Beis HaMikdash. The Yisrael is gathering in his town. So I'm going to be spending my whole week dedicated to tefillah, avoda. There's plenty of time to take care of my laundry and plenty of time to take care of my personal grooming needs during that week. And Chazal were concerned that a person is then going to enter into their week of the Mishmar or their week of the Maimid in an unkempt state. Therefore, Chazal said, so how do you ensure that people enter into the week of the Mishmar, the week of the Maimid, with proper grooming, properly prepared? By telling you can't shave and you can't take a haircut the week of, you can't launder your clothing the week of, that therefore by definition necessitates that I take care of these needs prior to the start of the Mishmar, the start of the Maimid. So the Gemara says, Hachanami, Kedesh le'yikansu l'regal keshem menuvalin. It's the same idea over here. Chazal were concerned that a person might enter into Yom Tiv in an unkempt state. Why should I take a haircut or shave? Before Yom Tiv, I could just do it on Chalamayid. There's plenty of time. Or why should I take care of laundry right now? I could take care of laundry later on. Chazal were therefore and were concerned that a person is going to enter into Yom Tiv, maybe with unclean clothing, or maybe not properly, with a proper haircut, with a proper shave, properly groomed. So therefore Chazal said, how do we ensure that people take care of their personal grooming needs and their laundry before Yom Tiv? By telling you, in the absence of an extenuating circumstance, you cannot shave, you cannot take a haircut, and you cannot launder your clothing on Chalamayid. Incredible. So we'll say now the Gemara asks a couple of very interesting questions. By Rabbi Zera, Avdullah Vede Erev Haregel. But let's say, what happens in the following situation? What happens if a person lost an object? Right, a person lost an object. I lost my watch prior to Yom Tiv, and as a result, I spent all of Erev Yom Tiv looking for my watch. As a result of spending all of my Erev Yom Tiv looking for my watch, I didn't have a chance to get a haircut or to shave. So now what's the shaila? Do we say kevan da anis mutter? On one hand, we can say from the Mishnah, you see that extenuating circumstances allow you to shave and take a haircut and launder clothing on Chalamayid, right? Again, remember, all of the cases of the Mishnah, someone comes from overseas, someone was released from captivity, from jail, somebody who had their neder annulled, all of these are extenuating circumstances. So here, I spent the entire Erev Yom Tiv looking for my lost object. That's an extenuating circumstance. That's not how I planned to spend my Erev Yom Tiv. So do we say, since it's an one, since it's an extenuating circumstance, I can go ahead and take a haircut or shave or launder on Chalamayid? Oh Dilma, kevan delo muchacha mil salo. On the other hand, this is very interesting. Maybe the only license to go ahead and shave or to take a haircut or to launder on Chalamayid is when the nature of your extenuating circumstances are such that they're public knowledge. In other words, if you look at the list of extenuating circumstances in the Mishnah, these are all things that have a certain element of publicity. They're known, right? If you're coming back from overseas, people know that. You get out of jail, people know that. You get out of captivity, people know these things. So maybe the only time that you're permitted to go ahead and shave and take a haircut on Chalamayid is not only when there's extenuating circumstances, but extenuating circumstances which are publicly known. Because that way, if people see you grooming on Chalamayid, they're going to know why it is that you have a heter to do so. But again, in a situation like this where I was looking for my watch, that's not known. That's not a publicly known situation. So perhaps, again, that should not create a license to go ahead and shave and to haircut on Chalamayid. To which the Gemara says, Amra Bai Yomru. Kala srikin asurin srike baitos mutarin. So we'll say, so this is an expression that we've seen we've seen many times. The idea over here is as follows. The Mishnah Maseches Pesachim writes that one is not permitted to make srikin. Srikin is like a matzah wafer with an image on it. So normally, how would you make it? You'd go ahead and you'd have a dough and you'd etch in the image. The reason we don't want you making that on Pesach is pretty obvious, or even before Pesach, for use on Pesach, is because making the image takes time, and there's a concern that the matzah may become chametz. Well, there was a guy by the name of Baitos, and Baitos had a great idea, right? Baitos had a stamp, so you don't have to etch in the image, you could just stamp the image on the dough. So ultimately, here's the problem. So technically speaking, that should be permitted. What's the problem? When someone sees a matzah with an image on it, they have no idea if somebody did that by hand, in other words, etched it in, or if that's just the stamp. So the problem is if you allow it, then at the end of the day, it will lead people to make mistakes. That's the lashon. Yomru kol ha-srikin asur. Should we say all of the srikin, right? All of the designer matzahs should be asur, but the designer matzah of baitos is mutter. So of course, such a situation like that is untenable because ultimately, again, it's going to create an incredible amount of confusion. So now using that logic, it would appear based on this that unless you have publicly known extenuating circumstances, we don't really want you shaving or taking a haircut or laundering on Chol Hamoed, because people aren't going to know the nature of your circumstances and they're just going to assume that you've decided to do these activities on Chol Hamoed, and they may glean for themselves also a heter to be able to do this. To which the Gemara Tzulataneh, Chadam Rabbi Asi, Am Rabbi Yochanan, so what about the following case? We learned, or we will learn. What happens if somebody only has one article of clothing? So remember again, we just said before, laundry, said in the Mishnah, laundering is asr, unless of course it's an extenuating circumstance. Well, let's say a person only has one article of clothing. That's an extenuating circumstance as well. But it's so I'm allowed to launder my one article of clothing on Chol Hamoed. The Gemara says, but here's the problem with that. Hasam nami yomru kol ha-srikin asurin srikei baitos mutarin. Here's the problem. The problem with that case is, I will say, no one knows that I have one article of clothing. How does anyone know that? So if they see me laundering clothing on Chol Hamoed or wearing a freshly laundered garment on Chol Hamoed, so no one knows that I did that because I only have one garment. They're going to once again assume that perhaps laundering on Chol Hamoed is permitted. It's the same problem. In other words, I understand in a case where my extenuating circumstances are of a public nature. Then everyone understands my circumstance and everyone understands why it is that I'm doing these things on Chol Hamoed. But the problem is if you have a quote-unquote a private circumstance, people don't know about that. They don't know what to do with that. To which the Gemara says, We'll say here's the difference. Your belt testifies that. We'll say if a person only has one garment, so what do you do when you're laundering the garment? What do? You put on your cloak, you close up your cloak tight, and you wear your belt on top of your cloak. When people see me wearing my belt on top of my cloak, they're going to know that I have one garment and I'm currently laundering it. That's why I'm wearing my cloak like a garment, because I don't have another garment. So your belt shows. In other words, your belt telegraphs. Your belt communicates the nature of your extenuating circumstance. Ravashi Masni Boy Rabbi Zero Uman Sha'avdalo Aveda Erev Haregam Mahu. So therefore, again, I just want to point out. So the Gemara doesn't seem to resolve these issues, or I should say, it does resolve. In other words, it resolves it by seemingly saying that the only time that an ones situation, an extenuating circumstance, allows you to shave, to get a haircut, to launder your clothing, is when the ones is known. It's of a public nature. But if it's a totally private nature, it appears that doesn't create a heter to allow me to go ahead and do these activities. Now the Gemara asks another question. Ravash saying, "By Rabbi Zera, Uman sha'avdullah aveda erev haragel." I will say, what about in the following case? An uman. Right, so a craftsman. So I will say, let's give a good example. Rashi gives the example of a sapar. Let's say this: the barber. The barber lost his watch on Erev Yom Tov. Now I will say, if the barber loses his watch on Erev Yom Tov and he's looking forward to a whole day of Yom Tov, what's going to happen? Everyone's going to know. Why is everyone going to know? Because the line is forming outside of the barber shop. So here is an individual who lost an object. So the barber is going to look for his object, but the nature, and therefore again, he doesn't end up getting a haircut or shaving Erev Yom Tov, and the nature of his ones is known by dint of the fact that he's a service provider and a necessary service provider on Erev Yom Tov. So is that enough of a public thing that would allow him now to go ahead and take a haircut or shave or do his laundry on Chalamayid. So do we say Kevan de Uman hu Muchamilsa, since he's an Uman, right? He's a necessary figure. He's a craftsman. People need him. They're going to know about his own. They said he's looking for his watch. How do they know that? Because I've been waiting for a haircut for an hour and a half. That's how I know. O Dilma, Kevan de Lo Muchamilsa Kihanach Lo. Or perhaps we say the opposite. Maybe what we look for is not as much the person's personal circumstances, but rather the type of ones, the type of extenuating circumstance that becomes publicly known. So losing your watch is not the type of public circumstance which becomes is not the type of circumstance which becomes publicly known. Contrast that with the cases of the Mishnah: someone who's released from prison, someone who's released from captivity, someone who returns from overseas travel. The nature of those circumstances is that they are publicly known. So how do we analyze this case of the Uman who loses a personal object? Do we say on one hand, well, it's a personal object, and therefore, again, that's not the type of circumstances that become publicly known? Or do we say, no, because he's an Uman, right? Because he's a service provider, and he's not going to be providing that service in Erev Yom Tiv, everyone's going to say, hey, where's Ruvain the barber? Oh, he's looking for his watch. So his circumstances become known, not because of the nature of the circumstances, but because of the nature of the person. So how do we paskin? The Gemara says, teku. That it's a good kasha. It's a kasha. So also what you begin to see really is that this tension about do you need the circumstances, the nature of the circumstances to create the publicity, or is it enough if the person creates the publicity? That in and of itself is a unknown. That's a machlokes. Or you shouldn't even say it's a machlokes. The Gemara just does not reach a conclusion about it. Beautiful. Memedinas hayam. So as I remember again, the first example of an extenuating circumstance which would allow you to go ahead and shave or take a haircut or do laundry on Chalamayid would be someone who returns from travel overseas. Says the Gemara Masnisin de Rabbi Yehuda, our Mishnah does not reflect the view of Rabbi Yehuda. Why not? What does Rabbi Yehuda say? Disanya, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Habam Medina Salam lo yigaleach mipnei shiliyatza shelo b'rshus. Let's listen to this. Rabbi Yehuda says, if you come back from overseas travel, that's not a license to get a haircut or to shave on Chalamayid. Why? You traveled of your own volition. All right, come back earlier. Who told you? Who told you to start going on a pleasure cruise? Who told you to start going out and traveling? So Rabbi Yehuda says, if you're traveling of your own volition and you come back too late that you can't shave or take a haircut before Chalamayid, that's not a heter to take a haircut or shave on Chalamayid itself. Amar Rava. So listen to this. What I'll say. So Rava qualifies this a little bit. He says, now what I want to point out is that the Mishnah doesn't make any type of distinction. The Mishnah just says, Elu megalchin b'moed, who here are the people who could take a haircut or shave on Chalamayid, someone who returns from overseas travel. But the Mishnah itself doesn't make a distinction as to the nature of the overseas travel. So Rava therefore comes along and says as follows, Loshut divrei hakol aser. We'll say, if literally you're just traveling for the sake of traveling, Rashi says, Im yatsa shelo l'tzarech v'lo yatsa ela kedei loshut ba'olam. You're going on vacation. Going on vacation, you want to see the world. You want to see the world, right? So if you're traveling just for pure pleasure, you want to see the world, that's fine. Geh gesund hate, enjoy. But at the end of the day, if you get back before Chalamayid, you don't have enough time to go ahead and take a haircut or shave, that does not generate a heter to do so on Chalamayid. Right? The heter to do so on Chalamayid is only when there was an extenuating circumstance that was beyond your control. But if you're traveling of your own volition, there's not a heter. Limizonos, what happens if a person was traveling for the sake of parnasa? Divrei hakol mutter. Everyone agrees that's called quote-unquote an extenuating circumstance. By the sweat of your brow, you earn your parnasa. That's Cheshach Baruch who said to Adam Arishon. So traveling for parnasa is considered to be ones, and therefore if you did not return early enough before Chalamayid, before Yom Tiv, to be able to shave and take a haircut, you could do so on Chalamayid. So we'll say, where's the machlokes? Lo nechleku ela laharviach. Listen to this. Laharviach. We'll say, what about if a person's not traveling for parnasa, but traveling for profit? Namely, I have my parnasa. Baruch Shem, I have my parnasa. I'm traveling to make extra money. I'm traveling for an additional deal. So we'll say, so how do you look at that? So one opinion says, well, traveling for profit, for additional profit, not for parnasa or additional profit, that's like vacation. That's like vacation. And therefore, if you get back too close to Yom Tov that you don't have a chance to take a haircut or shave, you do not have a license to do so on Chalamayid. And the other opinion says, no, that's still called Mizonos. That's still called Parnasa. That you want to make more money? Okay, everybody wants to make more money. That's called for Parnasa, and therefore, Halach Lamais, if you get back too close to Yom Tov, you could shave, take a haircut, and Chalamayid. So also let's analyze. Meisvei, Amar Rabbi, Nirin de Rabbi Huda Kishatza Shalo B'Shus. Rabbi Huda's position seems to make sense when you left of your own volition. So if you're traveling of your own volition, right, you don't have to travel, you're choosing to travel, then halacha l'maisa, you don't have a heter to shave on Chalamayid. And the words of the Chum seem to be true when you went with Rishus. Now let's analyze this. Says the Gemara, my shalo birshus, what does it mean, shalo birshus? Ilema loshut. If you say that, it means that a person is just traveling for pleasure, just to see the world. So no, v'ha amrit divrei hakol aser. You said everyone agrees that is going to be aser. Ve'ela lemizonos. And also when we say aser, means you're not going to have a heter to shave on Chalamayid based on that. Ve'ela lemizonos. Rather, it must be that you're traveling for parnasa. Well, traveling for parnasa, v'ha amrit divrei hakol mutter. Everyone agrees that if you're traveling for parnasa and